Good evening, dear friends. This is Max at Murmanov with SRC Motors. I welcome all fans of technical sports, everyone who is passionate about them, and anyone interested in everything related to karting, motorsport, and everything around it. Today's topic is a comparison of the engines that are currently available here in Kazakhstan and are represented in the gearbox-free class, the adult gearbox-free class. These are the Rotax Max engines. I'd like to compare it, from a sort of mathematical perspective, as well as from an operational and driving perspective, with the engines that we've already had here all this time. Right. There you go. And, well, I'd also like to briefly go over the figures that, from my personal experience, have led me to certain conclusions. And I want to say straight away that this is purely my own opinion. I'm not trying to impose it on anyone. Of course, these are my conclusions, based on my own experience and, having been involved in karting for, over 30 years now, I suppose. Oh. And so, once again, I want to stress that this is purely, as I said, my own opinion. That's it. Some people will like it, some won't, some will agree, some won't. But I think for those who are just considering starting a career in karting, those who are only just thinking about getting involved, it will be quite useful to listen to this, at least for general understanding. So, I've put together a sort of table, and I'd like to make this comparison based on several aspects, several parameters. The first of these is the number of evolutions that a particular engine has undergone over the past, say, 20 years. Perhaps I didn't mention this right away, but I'd like to clarify that I'll be making the comparison in the gearbox-less class. As I said, that's the Rotax engine, the Rotax Max, and the OK engine, which is currently relevant in the championship as an alternative, right? And, perhaps, those previous evolutions that we saw before, and which I was lucky enough to own at one time. Again, I'll repeat, the number of evolutions over the past 20 years refers to those regulatory maintenance tasks, the frequency with which they need to be carried out at certain intervals, their intensity, regularity, and approximate cost. Right. Then there's the issue, such a point as whether you need to, or have the option to, service this engine yourself, or whether you have to take it somewhere to a service center. An equally important aspect is the possibility or risk of external interference with this engine. That is, those who know engines well, or think they do, always try to tweak things a bit to improve how it runs. Well, sometimes that can actually do harm, while in other cases it might help. So, whether or not such an option exists is, in my opinion, a very important point. There's also another point, a mental, psychological aspect, when a driver has to keep several things in mind in order to, drive a car quickly, a racing car, specifically a kart. That is, he has to keep the act of driving in mind, yes, so he's constantly working on it, putting in the effort. He also has to keep in mind certain aspects of the chassis, because the mechanic is constantly making adjustments, changing things, and each time he needs to remember what was changed, focus on it, and give some feedback to the mechanic, right? And here there are a few more aspects that I'd add, such as the engine. And so, regarding these aspects that mentally burden the driver during piloting and while preparing for competitions, I'd like to talk a bit more about them here. Well, this is quite an important point. Popularity and prevalence around the world. Yes, that's also a significant aspect. And of course, this should be mentioned as well. The presence of grand finals is also a significant aspect. Where they exist, it's really cool, great, and very interesting. I'd probably also like to say a few words about who actually refines these engines, specifically OK, previously ICA, and so on and so forth. Right. Who can you rely on, who can you trust, and how much does it cost, for example? Then I'd also like to discuss the initial cost of buying an engine, and some of the expenses over the course of 3 years. Yes, so initially you buy it, then over 3 years you carry out some scheduled maintenance, and then the value of this engine on the secondary market after, at the end of 3 years of use, right, what do we end up with, how much money do we lose, what's the residual value for us, yeah? And, a brief summary, what do we end up with in the end? Right then, let's get started. So, what did we list as the first point there? It's the number of evolutions that have taken place over the last 20 years. As for the Rotax Max engine, we're now talking about the adult engine, 125 cubic centimeters with a power valve. So, this engine was released in 1998, and over these 24 years, in fact, it has only undergone one major evolution. That is, in 2016 it was replaced by the EVO category. The engine was significantly improved, it became a bit more powerful, but at the same time, the optimization of the engine allowed them to be brought to a level where they became very, very, very close to each other, almost identical. That's it. But with all that, if we're talking about evolutions, it's just one change in 16 to 18 over 18 years. That's all there was. And for the last 6 years, people have been successfully using this EVO engine, and, accordingly, that's not a lot, in my opinion. I'd even say it's very little. Which, in principle, is an attractive point. Why it's attractive, you'll probably understand when I start talking about the OK category or the International Gearbox-Free class. So, in my experience, let's say, since 1999, back then, we were still racing with ICA engines, Intercontinental A, and there was also Formula A, but I won't really talk about them today, because that class was transitional and simply ceased to exist later on. And after that, we saw how it was replaced by the water-cooled evolution of engines. There was this water cooling system. After ICA, replacing ICA, several of them were produced. They were manufactured for quite a long time, meaning they changed, sometimes significantly, and were improved. But, in principle, it was always still the same ICA. Then, in 2000, and I can't recall the exact year now, the KF2 class replaced it. It became technically much more complex. It got, balance shafts, a power valve was added, and it got a starter as well. It was a bulkier machine, and at the same time its capacity increased to 125 cubic centimeters. At the same time, manufacturers claimed that this engine would have a much longer service life, so to speak. You wouldn't have to replace all those consumables as often. But unfortunately, simply because there were a lot more parts, it basically became just as it became more expensive to run than the previous ICA. And after a while, the FIA, the CIKFIA, stopped using it and switched to a new type of engine. Back then, it was called OK. And the OK has been officially produced since 2016, and it's been part of the championship since then. It became somewhat simpler. Yes, it only kept the balance shafts, the same 125 cubic centimeter capacity, and the power valve. The engine turned out to be very powerful and, of course, fast. It had a pretty solid sporting component to it. But again, in terms of operation, it was quite, expensive. I'll explain why a bit later. So, if you just weigh it all up, look, we had an air-cooled engine, then a water-cooled engine came out, then the KF2 appeared, then the KF3 came out. And now, one of the new modifications being released is the OKN class. Nationals, the N stands for that, right? The idea behind it is to give people from national federations the chance to get a more affordable, cheaper engine, and naturally, one that's less powerful. We'll talk about it later as well. Right. So, it turns out that with each of these 5 evolutions that have taken place over this time, every time the previous engines simply had to be put aside or sold off to regions where their use was still possible. Right. But the owner of such an engine basically had to sell everything related to it, and further use of it was impossible. So, over these same 20 years, we've undergone 5 changes, or 4, if you don't count OKN. And every 5 or 6 years, just imagine, you have to completely switch to a fundamentally new engine. Is it inconvenient? Yes, that's a bit of a tricky point. It is, if with Rotax there were only 2, actually, just 1 change. Let me remind you, here there were 4. That's a significant point. Each time, the CIKFIA, I understand their efforts, the Commission looks for new options, some opportunities to make karting cheaper, to make it more attractive. But at the same time, as you can see, each time they admit that, yes, it didn't work out this time. We hope it will work out next time. So that's basically everything on this point, right? Let's move on to the second point. As for the regulatory work, the manufacturer has stated that the Rotax Max in the Mini class, and I didn't mention that Rotax Max presents its engines in the Micro, Mini, OK Junior, Rotax Max Junior, Rotax Max Junior and DD2, which is the equivalent of a shifter cart. So, it is declared that in this class, the Rotax Max manufacturer, for example, states that the main components, like the piston and connecting rod, should be replaced every 50 hours. That is, for the Mini class, or rather, the Micro class, this is an absolutely enormous figure. At the same time, he mentions that for the other classes, the figure is roughly the same. But in practice, of course, we understand that it's actually much less. So, well, let's say it's 3, although my friends and acquaintances manage to run for 35, even 36 hours, and still somehow managed to win some very serious, prestigious races with such an engine, which shows that, in principle, even after 36 hours of proper use, the Rotax Max engine doesn't lose any of its power characteristics or performance in any way. That is, there's no risk of experiencing some kind of crash or unexpected breakdown either. So, basically, everything is fine here, but of course, many people play it safe. Many will drive for 20 hours, maybe 25 hours, and already try to change something, hoping that a new piston will give them a bit of extra power, just a little boost. When the engines are very evenly matched, mechanics, of course, try to squeeze out every little bit, maybe by adjusting the piston-to-cylinder clearance, maybe by tweaking the ratios, or by fine-tuning the carburetor and other such subtle details to gain that tiny difference, that tenth of a second. That's it, but when it comes to the OK class, the situation is, of course, different. Everyone who has used it knows perfectly well that we have to change the piston after a maximum of 6 hours. In other words, from my personal experience with the OK Junior, it was 5 to 6 hours before we changed the piston, because the clearance would increase very quickly. With the OK, it's even faster, and after about 10 to 12 hours, roughly 10 to 12 hours, you need to replace the connecting rod. It's quick, yes, about 2 or 3 times faster and sooner than in the Rotax Max class. So that's the situation here, yes. So, well, for one replacement of the piston and connecting rod, maybe it's not exactly parallel, but roughly speaking, it's one connecting rod for every 2 pistons. With the Rotax, we change pistons 3 times, but with the OK, that's already 5 or 6 pistons and 2 or 3 connecting rods. So in absolute terms, it's probably not that much, really. The difference is, for some it's $900, for others it's $1,800. And against this background, running the OK doesn't seem all that daunting. Well, although, yes, already in some regional races this does affect the budget for those who, really want to keep costs down, right? So that's something to keep in mind here. The Rotax is a long-life engine. It really is long life. The measurements were carried out not only, basically, as part of the standard procedures, and these measurements were done not just by the teams, but also by the factory specialists. It's standard practice. So, I've given you some rough figures. As for maintenance, OK engines are, of course, designed or intended to be serviced independently by each team. The mechanics service them, or the coaches, or whoever knows what they're doing. The Rotax engine, on the other hand, can only be serviced at a service center. Whether that's a plus or a minus, I don't know. Of course, you have to pay extra for it to be taken apart and serviced. On the other hand, in my view, this does somewhat broaden the possibilities for who can get involved in karting, that is, who can take part in competitions. If, for example, a young person wants to start their career in karting, and of course doesn't have any initial technical skills like changing a piston, a connecting rod, or doing even more skilled work, then it's a real challenge for them. They have to go to someone, ask, say something like, "Can you change this for me?" and so on, maybe queue up or something like that. So, basically, it's a situation that comes with certain drawbacks, right? With Rotax, it's a bit easier in this respect. So you take the engine, bring it to the service center, say, "I need this and that done," and they change it for you. You pay for it and leave. It's simpler. On the one hand, it's easier, but on the other, it's harder if there's only one service center and there's actually a queue, right? So it's a bit of a 50-50 situation. What else? Our fourth point is the possibility of outside interference, right? Rotax engines. All Rotax engines are sealed by the manufacturer from the moment they leave the production line. OK engines, they can be freely opened by owners, tuners, mechanics. And there are no restrictions in the sense that there are no bans. Actually, there are bans, there are rules, there are homologation cards, which you can't go beyond in terms of technical specifications. But many people start to meddle with the engine, to tweak it, using what's called a file or something like that, trying to increase the already high power of the engine. Here's where it's a double-edged sword. Some people do it well, they go fast. Others do it badly, ruin the engine, and in the end, they try to sell it off by all sorts of dodgy means, sending it far away, to other regions or even other countries, after such an unsuccessful tuning attempt. In Rotax, all of this is strictly forbidden, and even if the technical commission finds any kind of interference, say, with the engine, it is immediately dealt with harshly. The result is annulled, and that service center, because all the engines are sealed. I probably didn't mention that all those service centers or mechanics caught in such schemes will, of course, suffer the consequences and lose their license, right? This is a form of control, a way for the manufacturer to oversee things and provide a guarantee, of a certain equality of conditions and engines to preserve that, right? so that people can just put the whole engine issue out of their minds. In other words, just go out there and focus on your driving, on your piloting skills. This is the kind of system Rotax has introduced, and they've been implementing it quite successfully. Well, as for this, look, since I've smoothly moved on to this topic, I mentioned it at the beginning and I've brought it up again now. So let's just finish discussing it now and wrap up this topic, shall we? So, as I've already said, a pilot is constantly thinking, always running through various processes in his head, always working on his own piloting skills. He's always thinking, I approach this way here, I approach that way there. The mechanic tells him things, the race engineer gives him corrections, the telemetry specialist says, brake later here, enter the corner earlier there, be smoother here, open the throttle later or earlier here, for example. So, basically, he gets some kind of feedback from the telemetry specialist or the race engineer for almost every corner. So he's constantly thinking, and he has this sort of microprocessor in his head that's trying to make adjustments throughout the whole lap. After a while, he has to internalize all of this, bring it to a sort of automatic, mechanical level, so that the thought process doesn't slow him down. So, when he's driving on the track, if he consciously thinks through every single turn, of course he'll be slower than if he does it, as they say, on instinct, on a highly trained, instinctive level. But this aspect is always present. People do think, especially during training. The second thing he keeps in mind, they change his settings, they change the track width, they change the chassis height above the track, they change the angles, caster, camber. That's it. They change the rims, yes, they change the tire pressure. And these aspects are constantly discussed with him by the mechanic. The driver is also required to keep all this in mind. He remembers that they changed the tire pressure for him. Yes, he tries to pay attention to how it feels. He remembers, for example, that they changed the caster for him. He tries to understand how much sharper the car has become, what the balance is like now at the front, at the rear, how it shows oversteer or understeer. So this aspect sits right alongside the driving itself, always running in parallel, and he starts to calculate everything. And then there's the engine aspect. The engine aspect is a very serious one. Why? Because, well, when it comes into play, basically, all drivers who can't manage to go fast, their favorite excuse is to immediately blame a weak engine. So, the engine builder didn't do a proper job, something's wrong, the engine isn't performing, everyone else's is faster, that's why I'm falling behind. This is the most common type of complaint from a driver. When we say that Rotax Max protects its interests by making the engines as identical as possible, they're also trying to remove this aspect from the driver's mind. He doesn't worry about it. He knows that everyone has the same engines. He knows that the engines are roughly, give or take, the same, right? He understands that, poking around, getting caught up in all those aspects, like blaming the engine for being weak or not fast enough. That point just gets thrown out of his mind, and it's much easier for the driver to focus on just two things, right? That is, his driving and the chassis. Exactly. The engine will still be there to some extent, right? Maybe they changed the jet a bit, adjusted the throttle slightly, turned the valve, yeah? Changed the ratio there. This aspect will still be present, but not to the extent where someone is constantly thinking their engine is weak, that theirs is worse than everyone else's. That really destabilizes the situation. It really, demotivates the person. They start always trying to make excuses, to justify themselves, and they don't work on the other things, you see? They don't draw out all their resources from within themselves, you see, all the resources needed just to go faster, plain and simple. When everyone knows the engines are the same, everyone starts working solely on their driving skills, focusing on that. And the driving skills really do improve, so in the Rotax Max class, the level of the drivers is no lower than in some international OK class, and sometimes even higher. From my personal conversations, with the heads of some very serious factories, chassis manufacturers, or teams, they all tell me, for us, drivers who have won the Rotax Grand Final are held in very high regard. They have huge authority in our eyes. Perhaps even more highly regarded than drivers who have won the World Championship, where there's a huge industry at play, a whole industrial machine, with teams, engines, tuners. In other words, everything is concentrated there. It's just, 10, 20, 30 teams. It's just, 50, 70 drivers who are trying to sort things out between themselves at the World Championship or at the WSK, right? And here, everything is concentrated. It's very expensive. It's all very exaggerated, isn't it? There, yes, it's a battle between manufacturers, a battle of money. Everything costs a lot there. Whereas in Rotax, the chassis are the same, the engines are the same, and it's only the driving skill that wins. And that's why, in my opinion, I'm smoothly moving on to the next point, yes? Why did Rotax become so widespread all over the world? So, all those countries that have really thrown themselves into karting recently, well, over the last 20 years, let's say where it started to develop rapidly, like in Southeast Asia, for example, right? In all these countries, Rotax has simply taken a leading position other classes just don't make it in, because it's cheap, easy to maintain, the engines are equal, and the conditions are fair. It's honest sport, it's pure driving skill. Yes, all of Eastern Europe is into karting, America is all about karting. And in our neighbouring country, Russia, as well. Karting, Rotax developed alongside the international classes, and now it's much more popular than the international classes. In the OK class, until recently, there would be, 5, 6, 2, 6, 8 people. Just like that, right? In Rotax, 30, 40 people. So that's the effect of how it works, how drivers vote with their wallets for it, and that's why, yes, in Italy, the homeland, well, I mean where 90% of all karts of all karting is produced, yes, there it's not present at all. They ignore it, probably, I mean deliberately, not probably, but definitely deliberately. But in such developed countries as Germany, for example, both Rotax and international classes are present. In Scandinavian countries, some international classes aren't present at all, but wherever they are, Rotax is always there. And this actually clearly shows that Rotax is a really cool class. It's a very good class, very convenient and highly competitive. So, what else can I say? The presence of the Grand Final, yes, with Rotax, all the national winners go to this international Grand Final. It's a colossal event, as I already mentioned. In each class, there's a separate chassis manufacturer, the engines are all Rotax Max, all the same. Only the chassis settings and gear ratios differ. The engines are identical, so the winner there is truly the strongest, right? As I already said, for example, Rotax engines are not modified, right? That is, we're not allowed to make any changes at all. You buy the engine, install it, and off you go. And many times we've seen people just take the engine straight out of the box, get in, and immediately start competing for the top places. In the OK class on the international stage, where the World Championship's held, the situation is, of course, different. There are about 5 or 6 well-known tuners and manufacturers there. That is, those who fine-tune these engines, right? And here's the thing, yeah? So they modify them, and when you buy, this is the next point I wanted to mention, when you buy an engine, even though the price of a new engine is roughly the same, maybe, let's say, give or take, it's about 3,000 euros for a Rotax. Okay, OKN, maybe OKN will be a little cheaper, but more or less that's the price. With Rotax, you take a standard engine straight out of the box, as I said, and you go out aiming for first place. Okay, everyone strives for this, because the engine factor dominates everything there, right? Everyone wants to get that fastest engine. That's where this whole story begins, not just chasing a standard engine, but going after a top-notch engine from some tuner. Be it Magic, be it Galifa, be it Gordon GFR, or any number of others. In other words, everyone wants to get an engine that will give them some sort of advantage, right? Everyone is chasing after these engines. They buy them, or at least try to buy them, yes. And that's at least another 1,000 euros on top. And those are extra expenses. And if you're a fast pilot or in one of the top teams, that means 2 engines. So you're already buying 2 engines, right? And there you go, 3,000 euros, you've bought the original engine and this one. Not to mention, remember, we calculated the expenses over 3 years, plus here it's 900 euros, there it's 1,800, 2,500 euros. But that's not as big a difference as when you're buying 2 engines. Here you already have to pay extra for the tuner, for each one about 1,000 here, 1,000 there, and so on. And what's most, unpleasant, you could say, right? Let's say this engine, the OK, has been produced here since 2016. Yes, 6 years. Every year, almost every year, the factory says, yeah, guys, everything was great. In 2 years, we're releasing a new evolution. This will be an engine that goes faster than the previous one. That's it, everyone's switching to this engine. Okay. Everyone who had those engines, who drove them and thought they were fast, now has to buy new engines. But that's just the factory. Now, every tuner, like Galifo, Gianfranco, Masek, Yuri, I don't know, Gordon, Gaffer, each of them practically releases a new version of their engine every year and again says, guys, everything's faster now, it's great, come over, buy it, get it. And they start imposing this arms race. The factory gives you updates, the tuners give you updates. You've done a season, Sometimes, by the end of the season, a new version is already out, and you're forced to sell these engines. And what's most important is that these engines are sold much cheaper than, well, new ones. You bought it for 3,000, paid the tuner another 1,000, so 4,000 in total, and then you sell it for 1.5. Because nobody needs this engine anymore. Everyone knows it's an engine from the previous generation, the new ones are faster, and no one's interested in it anymore. This kind of arms race hits your wallet much harder than those running costs we talked about at the start, piston, connecting rod, and so on. So, if you add all this up, I'll post a table later, and you'll be able to look through it all and see for yourself. But again, as I said, these are my calculations, based on my own experience with running various engines. But here the difference can reach, well, in my view, for example, with a Rotax, the loss over 3 years might be around 900 euros, say 1,000, maybe 1,200, give or take. Because Rotax engines are then sold almost at the price of new ones, since they do some kind of rebuild. They change the connecting rod, the main bearings, the oil seals, the piston, essentially, it's a new engine. So, if you bought it for 2,700, you can easily sell it on, right? As for the OK, as I said, you lose out there, for example, it was 4, and then you sell it for 1.5, and no one cares anymore what kind of tuning it had. And you basically just throw away that 1,000 euros, right? But then, plus running costs, plus this and that, altogether it comes to about 4,200. And 6,200, that's if you have a tuned engine. Because over those 3 years, you'll change several engine evolutions twice, swap them out. Yes, since you want to go faster, you have to, well, it's an arms race. Your main competitor this year bought himself a new evolution. You automatically rush out to buy the same one, because you don't want to fall behind in the engine department. Then someone else buys a new engine the following year. And every year, essentially, if you want to stay at the top, depending on how competitive your environment is, you are obliged, you are forced to buy. This arms race is imposed on you to keep buying, buying, and buying. And I'll say it again, operating costs aren't as important as the expenses, say, related to upgrades or changing engines. And here, things get much more expensive, you see. So, well, maybe you lost 1,000 here, but there you start losing 5,000 or 6,000 euros. And that's not a very appealing prospect, to be honest, is it? So, when it comes down to it, what do we end up with? In my opinion, especially for beginner drivers, those who are just looking to get into karting, absolutely, you should start with Rotax. Rotax, because it's a more economical class, and the equal engines allow you to clearly understand where you stand, your driving skill level, and what you need to work on. The engines are serviced at a technical service center, and all of this is cheaper. And that's why, for me personally, for example, the way I see it, yes, it's a bit weaker, but by the way, we haven't mentioned this OKN engine, OK Nationals, yet. It's missing that power valve. The manufacturer, in doing so, was aiming to make its lifespan a bit longer, so that consumables wouldn't need to be changed as often. And perhaps they will achieve that goal. Why? Because they've limited the revs to 15,000 and removed the power valve. As I understand it, from what I can tell, it's now going to be about the same as the Rotax Max in terms of power, since the Rotax Max also has 15,000 revs, but it still has the power valve, right? But I don't think it will be more powerful than the OK Nationals, though they'll be close. But the most important thing is that, after all, the OK Nationals, just like the regular OK, will constantly be subject to upgrades. The evolution of tuners won't stand still, you'll constantly be offered a new version. In fact, they're already offering it, the engine is coming out next year, it's being proposed for the regions, but all the tuners are already rubbing their hands together and saying, yes, we're waiting for this engine, we want to work on it, we'll be offering you some souped up versions. Some people claim that this is quite an open and honest approach. But I don't think so. I believe that even at the big championships, yes, where, I don't know, each class gathers 30 or 40 drivers, with 200 drivers at the championship. Even there, how many of these tuners are there? 5, 6, 7, those who are really in the know, in the loop, but actually it's even fewer, maybe 4 or 5. And usually, only 2, 3, maybe 4 people from a given region are in contact with them. As a rule, it's a kind of closed club. He works with them, everyone buys their engines from him. If someone has a team in their own championship, they work with this tuner, they bring in these engines. No one will ever give you an engine better than the one they keep for their own team. It's always, a double-edged sword. They tell you, yes, here's a great engine from this tuner, you'll be going really fast, but you won't be faster than them. because they'll still have a better engine, yes. And here, again, that little worm of doubt creeps in. What if I take it, and it turns out to be worse? And everyone understands, well, that one definitely won't give me anything better, right? And as we know, for example, even at the WSKL Championship, at the World Championship, among these engine tuners, in reality there are only about 2 or 3 super fast, extremely fast ones, then 10 to 15 that are just fast, and another 20 to 30 that aren't really that fast compared to those, right? So it turns out that it's selective. It depends on the tuner who will win the championship, right? Meaning without that super fast engine you won't win. He only gives it to those who can really take first place, because then his name goes to the top, and his sales increase, his popularity grows, the popularity of that engine tuner. That's why he gives these engines to the top 3, let's say, potentially at most, potentially, and then to another 5 or so who are close, nearby, and to everyone else just by name, like, here you go, this engine is the same as everyone else's. But you don't know how to drive yet, so work on your piloting skills. That's why you can't win. There are a lot of subtleties there, connected to the fact that those who know, those who are in the loop, they understand, and they sort of filter the whole rest of the flow of these engines for their own market. It's a subtlety, yes. Dishonesty, I think, it's colossal dishonesty, to be honest. And with Rotax, there just isn't such a problem from the start. Yes, so people go, and my friends, for example, who work on tuning engines and have their own test benches, they've installed Rotax engines many times. Guys would come, experiment, and we experimented ourselves. We install the engine, change the cylinders, change the exhausts, change the carburetors in the Rotax Max. Yes, the difference might be, say, up to half a horsepower, but no more than that. Why? Because, and on the track, it practically makes no difference. If in one range the engine is more advantageous, in another range it falls off, so somewhere it gains on the exits, then loses on the straight, and they end up balancing each other out like that. Accordingly, there's practically no advantage at all. Even if on the dyno it shows a difference of half a horsepower, on the track the lap times are exactly the same, tenths of a second, no one is pulling away from anyone. So, in the end, yes, for example, I only expect the highest level of driving skill from classes like Rotax Max. So, the focus is on the driving itself, yes, meaning we can set aside unnecessary thoughts about the engine. Thanks to this, participation numbers start to grow. The class is cheaper, you can buy a used engine and compete on equal terms with those who have been racing for a long time. I mean the old engines, the new engines perform more or less the same. In these classes, participation numbers immediately start to grow because of this, and as more people join, competition and the skill level of the drivers automatically increase. One thing leads to another, and the driver's level starts to rise. So, for those countries where karting isn't yet that popular, where you don't get 20, 30, or 40 people in a class, in my opinion, Rotax is the most essential class. Because with the international classes, as we can see from our own experience in Kazakhstan, we had 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 people, no more than that. And that's because of all these reasons. Nobody wants to get involved, it's expensive, and you can't just buy an engine quickly. 2 or 3 people control the situation, those who have also gone abroad, raced there, and then the local championship just doesn't interest them at all. 6 people are spread out across the track, and after 2 laps, it's not a competition for them anymore, just a sort of training session on a more or less prepared surface. These are all the subtleties, all the nuances. I'm not expecting any miracles from the upcoming generation in the OKN class either. In my opinion, it will be exactly the same there. So, what can you say? Are people demotivated by the international classes? Yes. Where there's a lot of money, where sport has always been popular, and so on, well, yes. Even, in my opinion, even in our post-Soviet republics, like the Baltics, where karting and technical sports have always been a cut above the rest. Even there, people have chosen to race in Rotax and recognize this class as the most economically sensible, the most cost-effective. It works. This approach works. Rotax has proven its suitability, viability, economic efficiency, mass appeal, and popularity. And thanks to Rotax, this powerful selection, for example, is pushing motorsport forward and developing it as a whole because it becomes widespread, it becomes popular, it becomes interesting to sponsors, and it attracts a much broader audience. And all of this, as I said, is like a chain reaction that starts to grow exponentially. That's why, for countries where all of this is just beginning, emerging, and developing, I believe that Rotax is exactly the class that is simply essential. Well, that was a bit of an overview, perhaps not the shortest one, you know? I tried to present all the arguments I have at hand. Perhaps I missed something. Please do subscribe to the channel, write and leave your comments. We'll be happy to respond, and perhaps even make separate videos addressing your comments. We're genuinely interested in any opinion, and we'll be glad to hear from you. And for now, goodbye. This was Maxat Mermanoff with you. All the best. Goodbye.